Thanks for joining our second workshop in the series on land use and land cover products and services for the Australian Earth Observation Government Network. I'm Stuart Finn at the University of Queensland, so I'll be chairing things today. Just before we begin, I did want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, air and water on which we meet all across Australia, and pay our respects to elders past and present and their emerging leaders in the current and next generation. Just in terms of running things today, for those of you that haven't been on these workshops before, we do try to keep your microphones mute and your cameras off until we do need to discuss things. If you do have a question as we're going along, feel free to type it into the chat window and we'll try and respond, or put your hand up, or just if you could interrupt as well, that would help. I do also need to let everyone know we are recording today, so the audio, the visuals and all the text in the chat window is recorded. The other thing I'll mention is that the material that we collect today and over the previous workshop and the upcoming one next week, we'll go into a report that everyone will be able to access and see. So that's some basic housekeeping. Just like to welcome everyone. We'll do a quick run around again in a minute. We've got a slightly different group to yesterday, but I'll just provide some context in terms of where we're going, and then basically get on with today. So we have just over an hour to run through this. This is the second workshop in this particular series. And as mentioned before, this is an activity looking at how we link through to government delivery of products and services for land cover and land use. It's been primarily enabled and delivered through Geoscience Australia. So just in terms of how these workshops are actually running and what we're doing today. So last year, as a number of you know, we ran a background workshop looking at how remote sensing is used in terms of government monitoring and mapping at national levels, but also state and territory, and how those activities fit in with work that's going on in our research sectors, universities, research organisations, private industry and research infrastructure, and how do we link all of those parts more effectively together. And there is a report from that which you have access to in your participants folder, which I'll come to in a minute. That workshop identified several priorities to take forward in terms of linking research to operational delivery and trying to push these things forward. Land cover and land use products and services were one of those key areas. Vegetation properties was the first one, which we've already done. So that was last year. We did a pre-survey across the community beforehand with all of this material as well. All right, and that's also in the participants folder as well for you to have a look at. John Lay is just noting your question there. Yes, the PowerPoint we'll put onto the participants drive for you to access as well. The session yesterday was a broad discussion across Commonwealth agencies, state and territory agencies, some research institutions, NGOs and universities about how, I guess, the research to operations landscape fits together. And it was looking at this diagram in terms of how we move. You look at the red line at the top, from research to research proven to operational activities. And we did discuss things, talked about a number of, what was the current state of progress in those areas, particularly in land use. So James Stewart gave us a good summary presentation of that. And we presented a number of questions which people have answered over the last 24 hours. And I'll present a summary of that in a minute. And the responses that we got back from that group of people gave us an idea of how do we want to move forward with modifying our land use and land cover products and services at a national level, what we potentially might need to do at a state and territory level, and then what needs to be done in the research sector side of things to keep making sure we've got the best available data and processes to deliver up-to-date and usable algorithms for land cover and land use mapping to move forward. And so yesterday was that broader discussion. The aim of the group that we've got together today is to say, okay, if we do identify products and services that do need to be changed or updated, how do we do that at a Commonwealth and a state to territory, at a Commonwealth level and a state and territory level? One of the advantages of this space that we're working in is that there are national coordination processes in place through the collaborative land use mapping program, and we'll come to that in a minute. So there is a mechanism to allow coordination from state and territory levels upwards to national level work, which is critical for Commonwealth agencies for using information, whether it's for land or environmental accounts and for a range of other activities. So today is about how do we actually work with groups like ACCLUMP or NCLUMI and basically bring in the research and also get things out to be used operationally as well. The final workshop, which will be next week, will be looking forwards in terms of what's happening in terms of available data sets, processing techniques like machine learning or AI, what programs are already in place in state and territory institutions to build sort of machine learning AI approaches to automated land use mapping, at sub 5 meter pixel scale. And some of the states and territories have already tackled that. So how does that potentially link up nationally? So next week's really about the forward-looking part of it. Today is about the operational side. And after we finish the workshop, the material that we collect will go into a transition plan document. We're doing these for each of those priorities that you can see on the far left. So for vegetation, this one will be on land cover and land use. And that's going to set out that research to operational landscape, a rough idea of the current status of it and what are priority activities at each area, and put those out to the relevant groups to implement them as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing there, and I did want to change the sharing to having a look at just my browser page at the moment. So this is sort of the outline of, I guess, yesterday and then also today in terms of what we're doing. And you can see we've done a bit of a background. The focus of today is really going to look at how what came out of yesterday and how that might move forward to helping operational agencies. So I'll do a summary of those things in a minute. I've asked, as we had a bit of detail on land use yesterday, I've asked Norman to do a little bit of detail on land cover today and where we're at with that. And then we'll finish off with the discussion of how can we progress this and another set of questions to move forward, and then wrap up for today. So just a quick overview of some other key points. The participants directory, which you will have access to, has a number of documents in it, which I should have shown yesterday. they've got the report from the 2019 workshop, which a number of you were at, which looked at all of the different sort of Commonwealth, state government needs and research needs. There's our summary database in there, which is by no means complete. There's a preliminary survey from this year where we asked people some update questions. Norman's presentation's in there at the moment. So just to highlight that's the report that's online. If you do want to have a look through it, I commend you to have a look at it. If you haven't, it gives you an idea of the scope of work of these areas. This is the database that we have, which is essentially a spreadsheet showing products, who produces them, what category. It is definitely not complete, and that's something that we need to work on as well. For those of you that were here yesterday, and for those of you that are new today, this is an example of how we collect information from surveys like the questions for today, where you get a form like that, you get a series of questions. This is the output that we get. So for each person, you get your answers for each of the questions, like, you know, the improvements, unmet needs, new capabilities. And so we've collected that for the, I guess, the questionnaire, look through that, and we present a summary today. And this information will also present in the workshop, so in the workshop reports later on as well. So that's essentially the material that's there. Just briefly, before we get into what we covered yesterday, could we go round the room just quickly, as we have got probably a 50% turnover in people. I know some of you went through this yesterday, but it is helpful to know who's on the call for everybody's sake as well. So I'll just identify people, and if you can just introduce yourself and your organisation, that'd be good. So I'm Stuart Finn, University of Queensland, as well as Earth Observation Australia, and I'll go to Norman Mueller next. You just have to unmute yourselves.
Hey everyone, Norman Mueller from Geoscience Australia. I'm a Director of Product Development for Digital Earth Australia.
Thanks, Norman. Grant Staven.
G'day, Grant Staven from Northern Territory, Department Environment and Natural Resources, and I've worked on land use mapping and with land cover data. Thanks.
Thanks, Grant. And Jane Stewart.
Jane Stewart from the Department of Agriculture and Water and the Environment in ABARES. We look after forest and land sciences, involved in land use mapping and fractional ground cover.
Thanks, Jane. Matt Miles.
G'day everyone, Matt Miles, South Australian Department for Environment and Water. I know most of the people around the room here, I think. I'm involved in land use mapping and other activities.
Thanks, Matt. Dan Tyndall.
Thanks, Stuart. Hi, everyone. Dan Tyndall here, Science Leader at Department of Environment and Science in Queensland Remote Sensing Centre and Joint Remote Sensing Research Program.
Thanks, Dan. Lucy Randall.
Hi, it's Lucy Randall from ABARES. I've been involved in the land use and the land cover for some time, and I work with Jane in ABARES, Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment.
Well, thanks, Lucy. Lindsay Mitchell.
Hi everyone, Lindsay Mitchell from Tasmanian Department of Primary Industries, Parks, Water and Environment. So I work in the Natural Values branch, and we use both land cover and use that.
Thanks, Lindsay. Rakesh Devadis.
I'm Rakesh Devadas. I'm also from ABARES, working with Lucy and Jane Stewart. I'm working on national scale land use mapping. Thanks.
Thanks, Rakesh. Joel McKechnie.
Hi everyone, Joel McKechnie from the Applied Agricultural Remote Sensing Centre from University of New England. Yeah, apologies that Craig Shepherd wasn't able to attend today, so I'll be filling in for him.
Thanks, Joel. Phil Norman.
Hi, it's Phil Norman here. I'm part of the Department of Environment Science with Dan. I'm looking after the Queensland Land Use Mapping Program these days.
Thanks, Phil. Simon Jones.
Hey, Simon Jones from RMIT University in Victoria.
Well, thanks, Simon. Ali.
Ali Cowood. I work in Environmental Economic Accounts section in the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment.
Well, thanks. And Larissa.
Good afternoon, Larissa Marfan from Earth Observation Australia, based at University of Queensland. If anyone has any problems accessing documents today, just send me a message through the chat window.
Thanks, everyone. Did I miss anyone? I think I've got everyone. No.
Just John, but he doesn't.
Oh, sorry, John.
It's all right. John Lees, I'm from the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Got a great interest in the land use and land cover work, so our work with Dust Watch and System of Environmental Accounting. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I appreciate everyone being patient with that. We'll try and work out more effective ways of doing it in future. Okay, so just switching back to focus of today. Here's a slightly modified version of the process through the different components here. The workshop yesterday, when we looked at the responses which people had given in terms of priority products for transition and what are critical issues that we should be considering here. There were a number of commonly identified improvements across people's responses to both land use and land cover, and I'll come to those in a minute. So they were improvements that go from sort of operational to research levels. There was consensus just on the organising bodies and what we might be able to add in or do slightly differently in terms of collaborative land use mapping and collaborative land cover mapping as well. Some specific changes were suggested in terms of the land use mapping side of things, not as specific on land cover, which is why we thought it would be a good idea for Norman to give us a bit of a briefing on where GA and Digital Earth Australia is at with the system they've been developing there. And then the last one is people did take hold of the, do we need a better way of dealing with training or calibration and validation approaches for land use mapping and land cover mapping, and that generated a number of interesting comments which I think partly relate to land use mapping being used quite extensively at all levels of government, from local to Commonwealth, and also that we have a number of industries which have a vested interest in understanding where their industry is and what status it's at, and there's potential for industry government partnerships. So there are definitely some really interesting points identified. The full details of those will be are in the people's responses to the surveys, which, as I said, will be in the transition plan. Just to summarise these before we hear from Norman and then go into the discussion. So the dot points that you see on the screen up there, which you'll also be able to get this PowerPoint in the participants directory, we've tried to go through and summarise out of people's responses. If you look at improvements across both land use and land cover, there was a common request for moving to more frequent collection or generation of these products, and the ability to actually use them for change detection, but also for looking for specific types of land cover or land use changes and transitions as well. So, and ideally those improvements should build on existing products. So that was quite common in a lot of the comments. Under land use, the improvements suggested were going into more detail in some of the classes, particularly in terms of production land uses, getting down to commodity level with crops, being able to look at whether or not you're dealing with pasture versus crop, whether you're dealing with irrigated or just rain-fed or groundwater-fed sources, better development of classes for land use in urban and peri-urban areas, change products, including the type of change as well. Land cover, we didn't see as much specification there in terms of required improvements other than having things be able to be updated regularly. There were a number of comments that came through about potentially a better way to map between land cover and land use classes, I should say, in terms of how they relate to one another. And I think that's something that may require more discussion, particularly around the groups that are responsible for doing our different national accounts with the groups producing this information. And that should say inclusion of industry instead of inclusion of industry in these activities, as we do have some industry groups that are producing land use information to keep track of what's going on, and others that do want to use and consume it as well. So this is an area where there is a need to develop a conversation with industry there. Organisational bodies, the land use mapping activities, obviously, which are, they've been in place for a number of years. You've got quite an active program there. This isn't about replacing that particular set of activities. It's, can we use what we're doing here to feed into that particular process, and can we engage with the broader community in a useful way that doesn't put extra work onto NCLUMI and ACLUM. The other thing that was noted about organisational bodies was that, yes, we've talked about products and validating products, but there's going to be an increasing demand for transparent presentation and validation of algorithms and processes that people use to develop products and services as well, and that's something that could be looked at later on. Just some separate points about land cover and land use products. They were, two similar points there actually. People talking about how do we include both active and passive data in generating these data sets, so imaging radar as well as high resolution optical data sets, particularly if you're looking at change over time. A number of groups wanting to look at the validity and I guess practicality of using machine learning and artificial intelligence for both land use and land cover mapping to be able to do it on a more rapid basis, and how sound that is. And that's something where we do have a number of groups who've looked at that already. And then also better development and inclusion of training and validation data sets for land use and land cover mapping. And particularly when we go down the machine learning AI approach, those training validation sets are going to become even more critical. So does this program look at establishing nationally consistent training data sets that are used for machine learning, basically land use mapping across the continent, maybe in the same way that GA provides their high resolution image chips for georeferencing. Maybe there's training sets for land use, land cover mapping that people can use in their purposes. So that came up. And then the last one on validation, that's something that needed to be discussed and presented more openly. And also in terms of validation, several people identified the ABARES approach to building a national fractional cover product, and the exercises that went around with communicating and coordinating across the community would be useful there. So that's a summary of some of the key points from yesterday, which I thought were really useful, and hopefully we can build a little bit more on today. So I might just stop there and ask Norman if he can do a bit of an overview of where we're at with land cover work in Digital Earth Australia, which I know some of you have seen, but not everyone's seen it. And this will help get us all on the same page with how do we go forward to the next step. So Norman, are you able to share your screen to do this?
I'll have a go. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yeah, just a little bit louder, I think.
Like a bit louder?
Yep.
All right.
Perfect.
I'll try to speak up a bit. And can you see presentation?
Yes, we can. Perfect. Thanks, Norman.
Right. This particular presentation is pretty long, so I'm going to jump a few slides. I did give it to a collection of people from ABS and Department of Ag, Water and Environment a few days ago, so those of you in those areas will have seen this. And it does pretty much cover what I talked about yesterday, but I'll give you a bit more detail. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to provide land cover for Australia. This is in response to the need to provide information for the system of environmental economic accounting and also for sustainable development goals. On top of that, there's a strong driver to provide information for environmental monitoring and so on from the federal departments as well. So we're trying to meet those needs in doing this. Because of the timeframes that are required for the reporting, we are starting with Landsat as our input data set. This is because the reporting framework that we have to meet is on the census years such as 2010 and 2015. So we didn't really have the new Copernicus data until about 2015 onwards. So at the moment, we're not really able to put that in there, but we intend to in future. And also other data sets that come from wherever, but we'll get to that in a moment. So I'll just start with, I think you've all seen what DEA is. Let's move to this slide. So this is the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization Land Cover Classification System. This is version 2 of their system. It's not the latest, and the reason for that is because this particular version, it is compatible with the latest one, but this one actually is nicer to use from an Earth observation perspective than the later one, which is a bit more complicated. The way this works is it looks at the environment and starts to divide it up in a sort of binary fashion. So first of all, you look outside and you say, okay, is the spot I'm looking at vegetated or not vegetated? Is it an aquatic environment or not? Is it a managed environment or not, or cultivated environment or not? And then that gets you to a point which we call level 3, which is, if you have a look in the first section of that particular chart, comes to roughly 8 classes. I say roughly because some of those classes are actually not particularly doable from remote sensing, and so we don't do some, but we'll come to that as well. Underneath each of them, we have what we call level 4, which actually breaks up each of these particular classes into detail. And that detail includes things such as, is it woody versus not woody? What is the cover? What is the water persistence, for instance? What sort of landform do you find in bare areas? That sort of thing. So there is actually a possibility in this to feed in information and get literally millions of classes. Now, we aren't going that far. We don't pretend that we can possibly do that from Earth observation, but we certainly want to get to a nice consistent platform which works across the country and fits into this framework. And the nice thing about doing that is that we can, instead of trying to address the whole lot in one go with one machine learning algorithm, we are pulling in the best we can find for each decision in that tree. So this particular system originated with Richard Lucas, and I think Anthea Mitchell also had a lot to do with it, and a few others. Having a look at how they might be able to do land cover, and Richard has been implementing this in Europe in various places under his Earth Observation Data for Ecosystem Mapping framework. It's the original version of this. And a couple of years ago came to me and said, hey, how about we do this for Australia? And so our project was born, if that makes sense. So in addressing the pieces of this puzzle, to do the different pieces, for instance, if we want to understand the difference between a vegetated and non-vegetated, right now we're pulling in the fractional cover product, which is the Joint Remote Sensing Research Program product, which has been implemented here in DEA as well. Then going on to the water, not water part of things, we're combining the water observations from space product that we created, the mangroves product, which is the collaboration between ourselves and Tern and Richard Lucas in there, and also our intertidal extent model. So that gives you the combination of the coastal properties, which are aquatic, and the interior. Although I have to say at the moment, we are still looking for a good wetlands product to put into this particular system. And then when we get to cultivated, we have a number of things that we're doing. So it's in the terrestrial space for the vegetated environment, we're having a look at essentially, did an area go through an extreme change in vegetation content in the period of a year? So we're doing that with a combination of feed-ins from fractional cover, also our geometric median product and the variance in that. And then on the other side, we are looking at a similar combination for the bare versus urban, plus a machine learning approach on urban. But then for water, we are just using the water observations from space. We are not delineating artificial from natural, because quite frankly, if somebody can come up with a way of doing that in a repeatable way, I'd be really surprised. So that's our starting point. We then bring all of that together into the one coverage, and that turns into the multi-class output, which we are starting to circulate at the moment. Now, we are releasing a draft product. We're going very, very slowly and just releasing to more and more people. We've started releasing to certain people in ACLUMP, in the states and territories and federal government, and we're just slowly going further and further so that we can manage the feedback, because what we want to do is get to a final which has incorporated end user feedback to get it as good as we can. And the thing we're aiming for, of course, is national consistency, probably more so than accuracy. We want something that can be applicable with understood caveats across the country rather than absolute perfection, which I doubt we'd ever get to, even in my wildest dreams. So I'll just move a little bit further. I want to talk about, here we go. So here's an example of the outputs that we are now showing for feedback. Now you can see there's quite a lot of classes on the left, but you'll also see that we're describing things in terms of, are they cultivated or not, terrestrial or not, vegetated or not, woody versus herbaceous, and then their cover percentages. We're not saying things like this is a forest. We're not saying this is a grassland or anything like that. We want that to be in the interpretation of the end user. And that's because each of our jurisdictions has different needs when it comes to what is described as a forest or whatever. So this allows this system to be applicable for a whole lot of different end users without ending up in that position of the federal government basically saying you have to call things the way what we want to call them. So we don't want to go down that path again. It also means that in doing this sort of thing, we can plug in different algorithms to suit. So for instance, if somebody comes up with a better vegetated algorithm, we can plug that in and replace, for instance, maybe the fractional cover has a new version. We want to go with that. Perhaps there's a new urban extent product, and we can go with that, etc. And that means that we can take the best in breed from across the country to fill that need. So on top of doing just a couple of years in the continental scale right now, we've run a couple of study areas for the ecosystem accounting at multiple years. So for the Gunbow Kundruk Paracuta region, which is on the New South Wales Victorian border, we have done a whole series of years. So there's about 10 years worth in there, annual, so that we can actually have a look in greater detail as to how persistent, consistent our algorithms are and whether or not it's working, but also so that we can combine this with CSIRO's work and the AusEco models framework and the habitat condition assessment system into feeding into the ecosystem accounts. So we're looking for feedback in multiple dimensions, if you like. Similarly, Kakadu is the other study area that's being investigated there. Here's another couple of example years, but there's about 10 or 12 years worth of data that we have for this area as well. So I'm going to stop there for the moment. It gives you an idea of what we're doing and that there are some test data sets out there for people to look at. I am going to be sending that out more broadly so that more people, especially in this particular cadre, can actually have a look at it. So if you're interested, please send me an email. I'm pretty sure a lot of people will, because then I'll give you access to the data. Might leave it there, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Norman. That was really helpful. It's probably I have a range of questions, but I'd just open it up to the floor for questions. So please feel free, if you've got a question for Norman, to type it into the chat window and I'll read those out. Or if you want to unmute your microphone and ask a question as well, that would be helpful too. Just what people are thinking. So Norman, what's the time frame on getting this to the point where you consider it's operational and then released through Digital Earth Australia?
The plan at the moment is that we will be incorporating feedback and doing validation for about the next 3 or 4 months before a final processing run before Christmas. And at that point, there will be finalized versions of the continental data for 2010 and 15, but then also whatever more we can fit into our schedule, basically, because once those are done and we're happy, then doing another year is just more processing time. It doesn't require extra hands-on in particular.
So, and what were those two base dates?
So 2010
and
2015.
Okay, right. So there is the intention that this is done on an annual basis after that?
That's right. We want to go all the way back to the beginning of our Landsat collection if we can. Now, there are issues with that, which is that we're pretty well served in the sort of near term because the Landsat archive is more stable once Landsat 8 was launched. Before that, it's pretty sporadic, so that the depth of data is a bit poor per year. So we have to see exactly how noisy it is. We've already noticed big differences in the noise content between 2010 and 2015. So we'll see what we can do.
Okay. Any other questions from people? I have several others, but I want to hear from people as well. So an easy question and a hard one. The base pixel size, the easy one. The harder one is, because it's from a range of sources, like what's the actual, when you say you produce a map of 2010, does that mean from July 2010 or?
Okay, good questions. So in fact, the easier one is to say it's calendar year data at the moment.
So it's over a year.
Yeah, so January the 1st to December 31st, making up a year. However, the accounts are actually run on a financial year basis. So in the final release, maybe we'll change that. Now there's a big maybe there, and that's because to do that, we have to reprocess a massive amount of data. Most of our standard products are being calendar year data, and that's what feeds into this. So to go and reprocess the entire archive is something of a challenge.
Okay.
Having said that, we're about to move to the new collection of USGS Landsat data, which means we're going to have to reprocess the whole thing anyway. So in terms of what the year might look like, we could move it to the financial year at that time, which will be somewhere also within the next few months. And the pixel size will change from what we currently have, which is 25 meter, to the standard of USGS, which is 30 meter.
Okay.
So it's quite likely that we're going to go from 25 meter and calendar year to 30 meter and financial year for final release, depending on what happens.
Cool. Thanks, Norm. Couple of questions. One from Lucy, and you partly answered this. Is it possible to get seasonal products?
We could do it, because realistically, the way that the data cube works, we can select whichever time we like. The issue that we'll hit there is that the depth of data might not be enough to get a meaningful product out of a season, because there'll be a lot of cloud. You know, Landsat's always been problematic in certain areas because of cloud. So I think once we get into the 2015 and on period where we can add Sentinel-2, then that's going to become feasible. But I would be reluctant to say yes for the older stuff.
Okay, thanks. And then question from Joel. Where could we read about the sources that inform the classification, as in cultivated versus natural? Joel, are you talking about training sites, or are you talking about the theoretical basis of it?
I'm talking about not the Landsat data input, but the other data sources that are informing this product.
Okay, so as it stands, all of the data so all the algorithms are running on Landsat. But each one of these is derived from a peer-reviewed published methodology, such as the JRSRP fractional cover or our water observations, or whichever. So if you want to know which algorithms it is, I can point you to our overview document. I can actually upload that if you like.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that would answer any questions I have. It's just really interesting to hear about the source of the algorithms.
Sure. I'll track down the Google link in a second. I'll upload it there.
A couple other questions one from Simon Jones. So is it, or will it be lead apps based in terms of the source data?
Good question. The source data is going to be, so it's USGS Landsat Collection 2. That will be coming online here shortly. But we will still be running it through our NBAR processing system to take it through to the terrain illumination corrected NBAR, so NBAR-T. Does that answer your question, Simon?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
No worries.
Thanks, interesting questions I'll do John's question and then Dan's, and we'll move on a bit. Two from John: are rangelands natural environment, and when's a pixel not vegetated? An average?
Good questions, John, as always. What do we call natural? What do we call cultivated? That's a really difficult question. We're trying to keep land cover and land use separate. So realistically, a pixel is considered to be cultivated if we get a massive variation through the year. It's the best we can do at the moment. We can't actually see that there's been, for instance, ploughing, or perhaps it's a sudden green flush from a flood event on a floodplain or something like that. What we can see from a cover perspective is that there's been a sudden, very large change in cover. So at the moment, the best we can do is to say that we have very wildly fluctuating versus not wildly fluctuating. And that's the best we can do at the moment for between natural and cultivated. For a pixel to be not vegetated, that's another good one, because the way that we do use the fractional cover is to say how long per year has it been vegetated. So how long have we actually had a vegetation signal from the fractional cover in that particular year? Now, if it's predominantly coming up with a vegetation signal, then we call it vegetated, but if it's predominantly not, then we call it not vegetated. But even not vegetated contains vegetation. So realistically, the not vegetated part of the hierarchy includes sparse vegetation. And in our bit of documentation, we actually call it sparsely vegetated and natural bare and not just bare, as is in the LCCS. It's tricky to separate them out entirely because it's very hard to see the sparse stuff until it flushes.
So I assume that sort of thing would be described in the technical documentation you mentioned before?
Yeah, at the moment the descriptive documentation is actually more of a user's guide, and it's a bit of an overview, so it doesn't go into great detail, but there should be enough to explain those particular separations.
Okay. Cool. All right. Okay, last question before we get to the wrap-up side of things from Dan. Are you likely to degrade Sentinel-2 data to 32 to add temporal frequency into this so that you can continue the 30-metre resolution? Dan's noting they've done that similar for reef reporting, and as 10-metre pixels might be just a bit of overkill.
Yeah, it's a really good question because, I mean, as Dan's alluding to there, 10-metre is such a much larger data set to deal with. At the moment, we're delivering, I think it's 35 gig of data just to do the 2 years. And that's pretty horrific for people to get a hold of. I mean, we will be doing web services, blah, blah, blah. But I would like to think that we actually do go down to 10-metre. I have to see how tenable that is. There's going to be some testing, and actually I'm really looking forward to catching up to Dan to see what his experience is, because I think that could be really helpful in us going forward and how we do this. I am keeping in mind, though, that what Matt Miles said yesterday, that there are plenty of things with a Landsat scale just isn't good enough to properly discriminate between certain cover types. So I think we need, it's going to come down to what is the use case, whether or not it's worth to go down to that 10-metre resolution or not. That's going to take some testing.
Okay, cool.
Stuart, just a really quick comment. Thanks, Norman, and for the presentation. I guess to pick up on Matt's comment as well, some of that, in some respects, I mean, it depends on what your application is. I think when you outline what your intention, primary intention here is that economic accounts and national consistency, etc. I think 30 metres is more than appropriate, and frankly 30 metres is appropriate for many applications in Queensland, even regional. That discrimination aspect is really important that Matt's raised, but what we've found is while you can still get that spatial discrimination at 10 metres, you can, in some respects, you can still maintain it because of the temporal depth of Sentinel when you move down in resolution. And there's all these challenges of communicating going from 30 metres to 10 metres, let alone the technical challenges. So anyway, just flag and love to catch up on that. That'd be really worthwhile.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's good feedback. And I agree, really the temporal aspect is more important, I think. But we need to test it out.
Right, thanks Dan and Norman. Actually, the last point Dan's raised, we'll bring up in the research session as changes from one sort of operating pixel size to another has quite significant implications on figures that we all report. So that is an issue I'll come back to. Thanks again, Norman, for that presentation. And Norman's slides are up on the participant directory. So just acknowledging that we're getting closer to the end of today. Hopefully what you can see now is my browser again, and what I brought up is the essentially the set of questions that we would like people to think through over the next couple of days. These questions will go out to everyone in the workshop series, but what we're looking at here is, how do we, once we know what sort of changes do need to be made, or what more information we need on land cover and land use, how do we actually look at bringing that into operational land use mapping and land cover mapping as well. So just I'll briefly introduce the questions. The first two are really, the first one's land use, the second one is land cover. And what we're looking at there is what's required for, state and territory, the Commonwealth sort of interactions in this area to help update products and algorithms moving forward in future, as the whole sort of the state and territory to Commonwealth component came up in our vegetation workshops. It was alluded to several times yesterday. It is something that ACLUMP and then Quinty do already, but what do people think would help to move those processes forward in future? And is it different for land cover than it is to land use? I mean, we're now in quite a different space in terms of the data sets we have access to, our ability to work collaboratively without necessarily meeting face to face, access to shared online data sets, and our ability to pull things together. So, is there a slightly different way we need to do things, and what information could we provide to groups like ACLUMP and others like yourselves to help with that? The third question is really around, industry. And we mentioned this briefly at the start of this. Some industry groups actively do map where their particular land use of concern is. That could be specific crops. Like a number of our grain producing enterprises do need to look at the extent of area that's under wheat, what the yield is likely to be, so they can help plan it essentially forward with transport logistics down the track. So there are already a number of groups that are doing this from an industry point of view across a range of agricultural, horticultural and grazing situations, and potentially other areas. So there's industry as producers of information, as well as industry as consumers, and that's something that it could be brought more into the discussion here. And all of you probably have different experience working with different industry groups. So if you've got any thoughts on, do we engage with Meat and Livestock Australia or, GRDC or other groups that have a good handle on what people are doing that we could work with. Non-government organisations are also a similar consideration, given that we've now got very large online satellite databases or processing portals, environmental data sets. We are starting to see a number of NGOs producing their own land cover maps or vegetation cover maps, or looking at changes in them. We are going to see NGOs running competitions through things like Kaggle and other groups to come up with new ways of producing changes in vegetation cover and could even be land cover maps that they're going to use for their purposes as well. So as a community, that's something we need to be aware of. Do we work, with these groups, and how's this going to work in future? It's not something that we can ignore and just think there's only going to be one authoritative algorithm and product. There's going to be multiple, and we need an effective way of discussing and evaluating all the different sources. And the last couple of questions were really just rechecking in on what was front of mind with everyone about, what are products which are just ready to be pushed out from being sort of research proven at a national level to being operational, and that could be some commodity level mapping of land use. It sounds like, the stage that Norman and the DEA team are at is pre-operational with land cover, and that's something that they want to go operational with. There's different state and territory operations where people are building more detailed land use mapping approaches that could be pushed a little bit further as well up to a national scale. So that's really trying to find out what people have front of mind that they know they could push forwards. So from pre-operational to state and territory down to research, and then if there's any other comments. All right, so we haven't had a lot of time for discussion around the bigger picture things here today, but we have had an update of where we are, at least with the land cover side of things. And we've seen where we got to yesterday with some clear directions for going forward. So this is sort of the next stage, is as we push things to an operational sort of point of view. What are the key things for us to focus on, products and service wise, but also about how we do it. So what we would ask of everyone is if you could spend half an hour or so on this form when you have time, ideally before next Monday, and just submit that, and we'll essentially be using that in the research activities and then the transition planning report, which will involve everybody in as well. So that takes us to the end of all of the set material for today. So again, I would like to thank everybody for attending. I know this has been a quick organisation. We got a lot of good response yesterday to the questions we asked. We can hopefully do the same today. I'd like to thank Norman for doing his talk, and also Larissa for setting up and running things. So just before we finish, any key questions or points that anybody wanted to make? Either type them into the chat window or feel free to say them as well.
Stuart, it's Matt Miles here. Just a quick comment.
Sure,
part of this, the challenge in this exercise is around, I'm going to call it governance, but that's not quite the right term, or, organisational arrangements between us all as we're kind of all coming together. There's another player here that's emerging. I wonder if Norman might have a couple of words just in terms of Standards Australia. Standards Australia have sort of chimed in with this international standard, or a need for a land cover standard, or a need to, express this land cover standard in Standards Australia paradigm, which I'm not overly familiar with. But I guess I'm just making the point that they're another group that we need to sort of consider. This is really all about these separate groups that are sort of focusing on the same thing. How do they all come together? So sometimes I have an issue with the focus on calling them products in the things that we're talking about, because in one sense, this is particularly this land use land cover one. It's not necessarily, well, it is an element about producing different products or operationalizing different products, but we're actually talking about refining the business model here that collectively we're focusing on, and it happens to be land use and land cover. So yeah, it's probably the start of a conversation, not the end of a succinct point. I'll leave it there.
I think so. We will make a note of that as a major point, Matt. So just the second point first. I appreciate you making that, and I think that's a really important distinction that this, you know, it's not just a product, it's the whole process, which is around, you know, setting up and delivering these things consistently. So we'll work that into the discussion. The Standards Australia question is a good one. I don't know, like, if Norman or anyone else wants to comment on it. We'll definitely take it down as a key point that was raised for consideration in going forward.
I can chime in just quickly if you like, Stuart.
Sure.
So Standards Australia approached me some time ago to be an advisor on the land cover standard for Australia. And the reason being that the international standard is being modified. It looks like it's being modified in line with the FAO. They are different, believe it or not. So it seems in future the international standard will go to the FAO one. At the same time, Standards Australia wants to get Australia in line with the international standard, but in doing so wants to have our input. So I've gone to our clump and said, hey, this is happening. And Standards Australia is chasing me to basically chair the committee that's doing it, which I've declined for the moment. But as it stands, I would really like to see a working group within our clump to address this, or at least to work towards it. If they want to go through me, that's awesome. I'm happy to take the chair on that, but we have to see where that goes. That still requires some discussion at our clump level. And this really comes down also to, I mean, where everything's going with national reporting to international reporting. Everyone, I think, wants to be able to report against all these targets on the same basis. And so standards are becoming more and more important. So yeah, one way or another, I think we have to engage with this.
Okay, thanks, Norman. That's really important context, and I do think it helps us think about how EOGN can work with our clump and each of the bodies here to, you know, provide additional information or support, particularly out to the research and other groups that potentially feed into what it's doing, and also help with the discussion about land cover. So, all right, thanks. Any other points that people want to make? Just mindful of time, we've gone over a little bit. All right. If not, thanks everybody again for your time. We will send around a summary email of where to access material. Please do take time to go through that set of questions, and if there are other people in your organisation or other organisations that you think should provide some input, please feel free to forward the link to the questionnaire to them. So some of you we'll see again next week when we do the research side of things. If you're interested in attending that and you haven't received an invite, let us know. Otherwise, everyone, you know, will see basically the draft version of the transition planning report when we get to that soon. So thanks everybody for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. Thanks.